Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's quick live broadcast, which is just going to be a quick little look at curves. If you're unsure how curves work, haven't used them before, don't quite understand the mechanics, then it is very straightforward and you should be able to pick it up fairly quickly. So let's move on to Capture One and see what we're working with. So tell you what, let's give ourselves a bit more real estate. And let's bring out our curve tool. First tip we're going to see in a second. And let's also bring out the histogram. We might need that, I guess. And let's hide our tools with the Command T and hide our browser as well. Right, first of all, when you're using the curve tool, you might find, on your display or interface that it's a bit small to be precise with your movement. So it is one of the tools which you can actually enlarge. So when you are, let's just reset it. So when you are dropping curve points on, changing the curve shape, you can just be a little bit more accurate. And let's just stick the histogram to it, make them both bigger, and then put them up here. So that just gives us a bit more room so you can see what's going on. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a simple RGB curve, or how the curve dialog works. We'll compare that to Luma curves, so you know the difference between the two, and a brief look at the different channels, red, green and blue, and how that compares to using the color balance tool, which the conclusion is it's generally easier to use the color balance tool if you want to use the curves for grading. So first of all, what is the curve actually showing us? Well, the curve also has its own histogram, which you can see here, starting with shadows on the bottom left, moving all the way up to the highlights on the far right. And then, of course, the height of the histogram dictates, if you like, the level of occurrence between all those different tones across the photo. So we can see in this shot, it's comprised of mostly mid-tones and shadows, and there's not a great deal going on at the highlight end, which is reflected in the histogram. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing to note is that we've got this little orange line dancing around. Now it's static. What does that actually mean? Well, if I just hover my cursor over different areas of the shot, so if I go onto the highlights, you see it move over to the right-hand side. If we go onto the shadows, let's just pick a dark shadow, you see it move over to the left. So that line is just really dictating where your cursor is compared to the tonal range of the photo itself. So how do we use the curve tool? So we've got this straight diagonal line going from bottom left to top right, and then we've got these two curious numbers down here, input and output, but it is super straightforward. So let's say we wanted to just change the brightness of a certain tonal range. So let's say we wanted to give the mid-tones a bit of a lift. So the mid-tones is obviously in the middle, so that's an easy example to pick. So I can click once on the curve itself, and then if I move the curve in this direction, that's going to brighten everything. Now, the point of these numbers down here is to show you the effect of what your curve adjustment has just done. So if I stick my cursor just on the dot as accurately as I can, you see the input is 122, output is 136. What does that mean? So before I moved that little point, I was at 122 on the RGB scale. So the scale starts at 0, which is for shadows, and finishes at 255, which is the highlight. So 0 is black, if you like, 255 is white. So 122, pretty much slap bang in the middle. So what that little curve change has done is brightened that amount, 122 to 136. So the mid-tones, which were ever at 122, are now brighter at 136. So that's why we have the input and output. Now, of course, because this curve is a nice graceful curve, funnily enough, it's also going to affect other tones in that range. So if we just pick, let's say we go right at the top here, what was formerly 228 is now 233. So it has actually brightened everything in the photo, but the majority is happening on the midtones. So if you want to be more critical with your curve, then you can, of course, add more than one control point. So if we stuck one up here and pulled that down, that would reduce the effect on the highlights. If we stuck one here and pulled that down, that would reduce the effect on the shadows. So now it is really more of a mid-tone bump. If I pull that aggressively, you'll see where it brightens or darkens like so. Now you can add as many of these control points as you like, of course, but with care, because obviously you're always looking to make nice graceful curve shapes. So if you have very abrupt changes, that can lead to posterization, weird effects, and so on. So something like this is probably not the kind of curve shape you're going to see all the time, but you can be very detailed if you need to be. Now, to stop you having to drop on loads of different curve points all of the time, there is actually a handy preset going on up here. So you'll find one called 5-point all channels. So if we drop that, that adds 5 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, top left, bottom right, across the curve. So if you do want to start drawing different curve shapes, or for example, brightening or darkening midtones, or brightening the highlights a little bit, or darkening the shadows a little bit, then that preset helps you quite nicely. Don't forget, if you want to preview what's going on with your curve, then you can, of course, hold your Alt key down and click on the reset button. Then you can see before and after, like so. So let's reset that again. Now, a common curve shape that you'll see if we bring back our 5-point all channels is an S shape. And that simply means what we're doing is we're darkening the shadows to midtones to some extent. Midtones is locked here, and we're brightening the brighter areas. So that's essentially giving us a boost in contrast. So again, if I option click the reset, you can see before and after, like so. So that's a very common curve shape that you would see. Obviously, the stronger or more dramatic you make that S shape, the bigger the contrast shift is going to be. But it does give you lots and lots of control for sure. Now, obviously, if we went in the other direction, brightening our shadows and darkening the highlights like a reverse S, that's going to reduce contrast. So really, the curve tool is really designed to play around with contrast or change the tonal levels in different areas, but it shouldn't really be a tool that you use to, fix exposure or something like that. So what you should be doing is being in a good place with your general exposure and so on, and then you could use the curve tool to move on to using contrast and so on. Okay, so we're going to look at the actual contrast slider in a minute, because that's also a good tool for you to use. The curve tool doesn't necessarily negate the contrast slider, or vice versa. It's different tools for different jobs, and there's no reason why you can't combine the two things together as well. So let's just bring up a couple of shots and let's have a little discussion about Luma range, because, sorry, not Luma range, with a Luma curve, because that's a subject that does certainly come up a lot. So I've got 4 shots here, and you might have seen me do a similar demo to this before. Now let's just shrink our curve tool down. Tell you what, let's get rid of the histogram. So let's just remove that. And let's try and, tell you what, let's just pop it back in the tool area so we've got more space to see all the pictures and we can hide our browser. So 4 identical shots, courtesy of Ines, who's in our development team. Top left, we're going to leave alone. Top right, we're going to leave alone for a minute. Bottom left, we're going to put in a S-curve like you just saw with our RGB curves. So let's drag in a fairly aggressive S-curve and let's pull the midtones down a little bit as well. So pretty aggressive S-curve, adding contrast to the shot, darkening the shadows, brightening the highlights a little bit, and pulling down the midtones slightly as well, which is probably, if you look at that, if I hover over the sky, you can see that's pretty much bang on a midtone. So before and after, like so. Now let's move to this shot, and then we're going to pull on our Luma curve, and we're going to do a very similar thing, pretty aggressive. Let's pull the midtones down as well. So you can see quite a big difference between those two. If I just hide my head for a second so you can see better. So you see this one on the right, to remind you, was a Luma curve. This one on the left was our RGB curve. Straight away, even if you aren't really looking that hard, you can see couple of things. First of all, similar levels of contrast. I've tried to match the curve as best as I could. But looking at the shot on the left, so this one over here, you can see the blue sky much deeper, richer, and so on. And where the warmer light is popping underneath, you can see that's, you know, warmed up a little bit as well. So adding contrast has also had an effect to the color as well, which can be good, can be bad. Over on the right hand side, the Luma curve, this one here, just hide me for a second, you can see similar change in contrast, but what about the saturation? So look at the blue sky compared to our RGB curve. You can see it's actually, it looks desaturated almost. It isn't, but what it actually is exactly the same saturation as our control one in the top left. So what Luma curves do is then separate out the relationship to color. So it's a purely contrast adjustment. If we go up to the right here, let's just throw in good old few points of contrast. I'll try and match the contrast to something like that. So relatively, I was, you know, more heavy-handed than what I normally be. So what do we notice about this one? It's not as saturated as our RGB curve, definitely not, but it does have a stronger blue tone, stronger warmer tones compared to our Luma curve. So really this contrast slider is kind of a good mix in between these two, which actually makes it a very useful tool for adding or removing contrast. However, of course, what curves gives you is the additional precision to place the contrast where you want. When you're dragging the contrast slider, if you like, in the exposure panel up here, what you're doing is just creating an S-curve or reducing the S-curve. So if I drag it in that direction, you can see a similar result to what I did with the reverse S-curve. If I go in this direction, you can see similar result if I did an S-curve. But you can't obviously control, you know, any of those kind of finer points. If I wanted to lift up the blue a bit, I could do so. I could play around with the shadows. It just gives you that extra level of precision if you need it. It also means if you're working with the Luma curve, which has decoupled that relationship to color, you can then treat saturation separately and dial in or dial out or as little as much saturation as you wish. But that doesn't mean the contrast slider doesn't have a good place in your editing workflow. Question from Matteo. What's the difference in using levels and curves, and is it good to use them together? Yeah, definitely, because levels is really giving you the base start point, if you like. So let's see if on any of, whoops, sorry, wrong scene. Let me just bring that back. Wrong shortcut, wrong application. So let's just see if there's a good example for 1 second. Let's just make a new variant of this one, because this is probably a little bit of a bright, slightly flat image. So looking at our histogram, let's just add our histogram tool back. Let's just stick it up here for a second. So this is a little bit bright, so I'd probably pull the exposure down, warm it up slightly if we want more of a teal look. And then now if we go to our levels tool down here, essentially what we want to do with levels is really give ourselves the default, if you like, the start point. From thereafter we want to control our contrast. So looking at the levels, we can now see that there's very little information here, so not much shadow information going on, and a tiny bit of highlight information going on. And the net result of having the full tonal range on the levels tool means the photo looks a bit flat. So you've got two choices. So we can hit auto, and that would just bring those shadow and highlight points in. Instantly, we then get the correct tonal range, or you can manually bring them in if you wish, but auto generally does a good job. Now, Matteo, you're at the point where you can move to your curves tool or use the contrast slider and then decide exactly what contrast you would like to add, like so. So levels isn't really about creating contrast, to be honest, because the only additional way to make more contrast with the levels tool would be to bring that shadow point in, but then we're going to clip data and then we're going to get nasty effects like this. So you can't really create or build contrast with the levels tool in the same way as the curves tool. We can brighten our midtones a little bit. So on this shot, I could potentially lift up those midtones a touch, and then we could move to our curves tool and then decide exactly what contrast amount we wanted to add in. So they definitely play nicely together. Billy says, when the RGB color lines start out on the left side of the image and they are on top of one another, does that indicate how good the white balance is? It can do, actually, Billy. In this shot, if we just reset it again, that might be a reasonable example of this. So if we just pull the... See, I feel that's a bit cool from the outset. And if we warm it up with our white balance, you can actually see those RGB levels converge. But that's almost like the perfect scenario. So if I had like a really dominant color in the shot, like probably this one, let's just reset our wacky curve that we did on there. So like a dominant color. So here we've got a bunch of blue sky. So we're gonna see a dominance of blue in that part of the tonal range. So it's not necessarily something you can rely on, Billy, but it's something that you can use as well. Because if we try to make these converge, you know, we're just going to really mess up our white balance to some extent. And the perfect white balance isn't necessarily the visual story that you want to tell as well. Okay, oh, Matthew's asked a question and Paul's answered it. What's the deal when either extremity of the curve is moved away from the corners? Is that called crushing the whites? Paul says, yes, you're effectively setting the overexposed, underexposed point to be tighter. So if we do that, if we go back to our boats again and we pick up our curves and we pull this in, look at the input numbers like so. So we're darkening down, we're saying, okay, the input value 36, make that 0. Oh, let's do it in RGB actually, like so. So as we pull that down, we're making it darker. If we go up this side, we're basically saying, look, the darkest points, make them brighter. So 0 now becomes 32, or 40, 50, 60, which means that we're making our shadows brighter and brighter and brighter. Same kind of principles. If you follow the logic with the input and output numbers, then you know exactly what's going on. Okay, so we went a bit off track with levels, but actually that's a really good conversation to have, because often, go away tooltip, often the two get confused, but they do different jobs, and you can't add or remove contrast easily with the levels tool without, you know, messing it up and clipping highlights and shadows and ending up with a bad result. Okay, all right, so what we're going to talk about next? Channels, I would say. Or just to finish that conclusion, if we just bring these 4 up again, go back to, that was our Luma one. Oh, I've messed it up now with our other adjustments. Let's just go back to this one. We're going to change this one to a Luma curve. Turn you off. We're going to change this one to a Luma curve, dial in our Luma adjustment, pull down our midtone. And now, of course, if I want to, I can decide exactly how much or how little saturation I was. So if you're a control freak, then you can use Luma and saturation in a really nice combination to give you the most control. Okay, so let's go back to our nice foodie shot. Just check we don't have anything going on. Now for the channels, I think since the advent, let's bring out this guy, the color balance tool. I personally have much less use for single color channels, if you like. Can we make curve a bit bigger? There we go, let's do that. So we can see what's going on. Let's hide the tools, let's bring this up, let's hide the browser. So with our individual channels, you are effectively just doing that, affecting the individual channel of the tonal range, whether it's blue, green or red. So if we're in our blue channel and I go in this direction, I'm adding a bunch more blue in. If I go in this direction, I'm doing the opposite. I'm taking it out, which is obviously giving me this cast. So if we go to green, then we can add more green, or we can go to magenta and so on. So it's the opposites of the color wheel, if you like. Same, we can add red, or we can take red away, which would give us cyan. So if you know how to mix colors, not something I'm especially good at, fully going to open up to that, then you can of course use this for color grading and blending. So if you wanted to cool down the shadows, we could put our 5-point all channels in, and then we could give our blues a bit of a boost in the shadows. I might want to move that mid-tone one down a bit and just have a little subtle lift like so. So that would add some cool tones into the shadows. If I do it more aggressively, then you can see what's going on. However, color grading or playing around with the color channels in this way, like the RGB curve is coupled to color, by playing around with the different color channels here, you're always going to be coupled to density as well. So when I'm pulling around the curve here, if I just do it ridiculously aggressively, then it's also brightening that area as well. So the two you can't separate with a curve. So then you might have to go back into Luma and think, oh, I need to pull my shadows down a bit, and so on. So you're kind of fighting at odds with each other a bit. But if you like to work in curves, if you're used to working with curves in Photoshop, then you can do the same thing in Capture One. However, to give yourself a bit of an easier time, if you want to color grade, then it's much easier to use the color balance tool, because like the Luma range curve, density is separated from color in this case. So if I want to add a color tint into the shadows, I can pick up the central point, move that to the color toning I want, but the density will not shift. Why? Because there's an additional control here, which is all about density. So now I've got independent control of the color tone and the density as well. And this way it's much easier to play around with color toning without fighting against each other with those individual channels. Ryan says, can you give an example when we should use the Luma curve rather than the RGB curve? Well, really, it's down to you. If you're playing around with an RGB curve and you feel it's pushing the color away from a place that you would like. So let's just reset the workspace for a second, back to mine. So if we take Nev here as an example, now this is pretty much straight out of camera. It's got a bit of red skin reduction, I think, on his nose, just with the style brush. On the background, we've just lifted the brightness a bit, but it's pretty much out of default. So I could then think, well, I'd love to add a bit of contrast. So if I dial in my RGB curve like so, pull down the midtones a bit, what's going to happen is by using an RGB curve, it's actually going to affect his skin tone as well. So that might be an unintended or undesirable consequence if you've of course spent a lot of time playing around with the skin tone, getting it look good and so on. So in that case you could think, well, I'd like to pump in some contrast, so I'm going to use my Luma curve, but Nev is now looking a little bit wishy-washy, so I'm going to add in the amount of saturation where I think it looks good. So essentially, Ryan, you've got the control back for the decision-making process. Now, of course, what you could do is also go to the contrast slider and do that, but even then he's still looking a little bit wishy-washy, so I'd add in a little bit of saturation as well. So it's all about giving you the control element as well. Okay, just checking on questions. Billy is off subject, so can't help you there, Billy, but I get your point. And I think we're pretty much good. I mean, David, if you lined up the different RGB on a grey card, would that ensure a good white balance? The easiest way to ensure a good white balance is to use the grey balance picker on your grey reference. If we had a grey reference, then we could choose that and pick on it, and that's the best way to do it. But remember, the correct white balance isn't necessarily the right white balance for the photo, but it can be a good starting point. Okay, I think, just looking at my examples and checking the time, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today. So, very simple, don't be intimidated by it. Also, don't think you're not a good editor if you're using the contrast slider, because the contrast slider does a pretty awesome job anyway. But the path to using curves is just to give you that ultimate control. And there's nothing to stop you using an RGB curve and then putting a little bit of Luma on top, because let's say you've added in your RGB curve to where you think is pretty good, but you're starting to feel that the saturation is maybe getting a bit too pushed, like his skin tone looks pretty good there. So now if I go to the Luma and think, I'd just like to have maybe a bit more contrast, maybe just open up the shadow a tiny bit more or whatever, then there's no reason why you can't combine the two together. So don't be afraid to do that as well. And there's also nothing to stop you then thinking, actually my blacks are a bit crushed. Let's just open up the blacks a little bit using this slider. All tools play very nicely together. Okay, let's see. Just checking if there's any other questions. Jimmy, watching from Singapore. Nice to have you, Jimmy. Must be very early in the morning. I think that's it for questions. Bob says, would be wonderful if we could have more than 16 layers. I agree. It could be nice to expand on that. So, of course, we will always take these suggestions back. Great. Thanks for joining, everybody. There's no webinar this Thursday, but there will be one next week. Do make sure to sign up for our newsletter so you always are aware of when new live stuff is coming. Of course, on our YouTube channel, you can always see upcoming lives on the playlist as well. And the easiest way to be notified is when we add something, remove something, is subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you press the little bell next to the subscribe box, as you saw in that wonderful animation, then you'll also be notified 30 minutes before we're going online and when we actually go live as well. So please go ahead and do that on our YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us today, and hope to see you all again next week and in the forthcoming weeks. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.